So here are the two renders I put together for feedback purposes, with the main focus being on the wood handle I fleshed out previously. I want to give a huge thanks to Rick Grieve for giving me a lot of feedback, but more importantly in the format that he gave it. He was kind enough to annotate images and color coordinate text and reference. This is definitely the best way of giving feedback, so again, big thanks for that. Implementing this feedback was mainly tweaking the layers already in place to ensure each element reads as intended. Some of the scratches on the handle overlapped and caused some unintended reads by forming weird angles, and the grain rings weren't accentuated enough and could be pushed much further to add further interest. All elements we can tweak fairly quickly and get a pretty big visual boost. Regardless of how confident you are with what you have established, feedback is the core of what we do as creatives, so take advantage of communities, co-workers, peers, just as much as possible. This is the first stage at which I've asked for feedback, so I'll iterate on these points and do another round of feedback later to a larger group. Continuing from the last part, all in all I'm mostly happy with where my materials are at, but I want to start looking at this rust layer to start pulling everything together. I want to think of the rust as my sort of blend between the paint and metal, using it to soften the transition between the values without being too dominant of a feature on its own. Harmonizing these materials isn't easy given how different and contrasting all of their values are, so this is one of the bigger obstacles I faced with this asset. I imagine everyone moving to PBR has faced the issue of having strong artifacts at the edge of a 0 to 1 transition between metallic and non-metallic values. I'll show you how I go about fixing this really quickly. You basically just want to add a bit of a buffer zone between the two materials. Here I add an empty layer, name it Metallic Correction, change my layer view mode to metallic, and then set it to pass through. For our mask, we're grabbing our main rust mask. Our aim here is to thin out the mask a bit so we get a bit of bleeding into our rust. We can do this with either a blur filter then a levels, or a bevel and a levels. It's worth playing around with both ways to see which works for your case. Our levels is just going to tighten our values inwards, contracting our mask and fixing our problem. It's worth mentioning here the leftover artifacting is from our sharpen at the top of our layer stack, which I end up lowering later on. Another thing I have that helps to blend the rust into the metal is a metal darkening layer, which is just an outline of our rust with just base color values of our Megascans rust applied, keeping the metallic value of our metal. The main part of what is going to blend our paint and metal together will be this rust overlay layer. This will add a soft gradient on top of the paint wherever we paint our mask. In our fill layer, we are referencing the color and roughness of our actual rust material with some added tweaks on top. For the mask, our first fill is our paint anchor point as shown here. We're going to add a fill on top of this, referencing our Megascans rust mask set to inverse subtract. Now I'm blurring it so that it spills over, and subtracting our inverted paint mask to remove all the metal, giving us just the spill onto the paint. This works quite nicely. Now that this is set up, I start using some custom stencils to work in rust around joints, moving parts and other areas, trying to balance it out and not have it feel too slapped on. I want to capture the bubbling of the paint around the rusted areas. I was initially going to drive this with one of my previously made masks or anchors, but my performance was dragging a bit at this point, so instead I'm opting to manually paint this effect in. The fill itself has some height established, made from some of the noises that I've manipulated with filters, so it's nothing too special here. And this is just going to bring in some of those secondary forms that adds to the read of the paint. With these new layers and amendments in place, I go for another round of feedback. John Joe Hemmons gave some great pointers in regards to the rust buildup being too uniform around the paint. After looking at it for so long, I thought it looked good, so again, feedback is so important to prevent these tunnel vision moments. John Joe also made a good point about having the rust be more desaturated in areas, so that's another tweak I can make pretty quickly. I'm pretty much in the final stretch now, so I rework my rust mask, add random spots of desaturation, and finish up with small tertiary additions like a random paint spatter and some more contrasting dust. Just lots of manual painting essentially. The last overhaul I throw into the works is a soft rust spill. This will show areas where the rust has dripped down onto the paint, giving it some direction, and it tells us a bit about the elements that this has been exposed to. So once again, we're building up that character element. Based on my reference, vibrant orange values really come through here. I'm using a technique here that gives me control over what I paint in. You can reference anchors in the same fill layer. So I have a paint layer in my mask, then an anchor point above it called soft rust spill mask. Then in the fill layer itself, I'm referencing it with a fill sublayer and using a gradient to have full ramp control. This is a great way of doing effects like heat discoloration on metal, so experiment with gradients and stencils. You can see how well this builds up alongside our rust. And I'm also using the smudge tool to emphasize the directionality. With some manual painting, I also tie it into the paint bubbling we just added to get these really interesting points of interest. I also build up a wood burn function using slope blur and a gradient on overlay for the base color. I really wanted something interesting on one of the wooden handles, so I opted for this kind of trademark stamp, something low profile that doesn't demand much attention. With the badly applied paint job with no finish, rust, excess grease, and general damage, I'm telling a story that someone potentially tried to restore this themselves without adequate experience or tools. So the texturing is finished now. When we get to this stage where we're no longer adding and we're at least somewhat satisfied with what we have, we can have a final look at it in our intended engine and do a full scope through to find any problems. It's also worth ensuring each one of your texture maps is consistent, so just scrolling through them with C in Painter once again, checking for issues. Anywhere we have bare metal should still read as close as possible to our original metal value, so for the sake of physical correctness, it's worth doing a sweep on this as well where applicable. Given that we have our sharpen pass-through layer as well, check for areas that may be affected by this too much, to the point of causing unpleasant artifacting like what happened with the rust earlier. Once you're all happy, you've probably got a lot of folders that have potential to become smart materials. Make sure your project is saved and start cleaning them up to allow for any mask to be plugged into the initial input. Things like our paint and rust can also be compiled into a solid base material for reuse later. And it's this reuse that helps drive efficiency and consistency through projects, so don't skip this step.